A routine shopping trip at a Trader Joe's in suburban California took a sharp turn when an elderly woman told a young black woman to go back to Africa. What happened next didn't just hush the store, it changed everything. Before we jump in, drop a quick comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I'm dying to know how far this video's traveled. Oh, and don't forget to smash that like button and hit subscribe so you're locked in for these great stories every single day. No more waiting, let's dive right in. The Trader Joe's buzzed with weekend energy. Sunlight streamed through wide windows, casting a golden glow over rows of organic produce. Carts clattered, conversations hummed, and the air smelled faintly of fresh basil. Danielle, 28, moved through the aisles with ease. Dressed in a forest green hoodie and ripped jeans, she reached for a bag of oranges, balancing her basket in one hand while texting her mom, "Chicken or pasta tonight?" Nearby, Margaret, 78, inspected apples with a critical eye. Dressed in a faded cardigan, her silver hair tucked beneath a sun hat, she muttered about high prices. Then, as Danielle's hand brushed the oranges, Margaret's expression darkened. "You people don't belong here!" Danielle froze. Silence rippled through the store. Then, Margaret's voice cut deeper. "Why don't you go back to Africa, where you came from?" The air thickened. Conversations died. Shoppers turned, some stunned, others shifting uncomfortably. In that moment, the store's familiar rhythm shattered. Danielle's breath caught for a heartbeat. Her brown eyes flickered. Shock, maybe? Or the first stirrings of something stronger. Margaret stood her ground, unmoving, her sun hat casting a faint shadow across her face. Around them, the crowd held its collective breath. The ordinary afternoon teetered on the edge of something unforgettable, and what Danielle said next wouldn't just break the silence, it would change everything. Danielle stood still, her hand gripping her phone as Margaret's words echoed through the produce aisle. Shock flashed across her face, her brow furrowed, her breath caught, but she didn't move. Slowly, she lowered her phone, the screen dimming, her fingers tightening around its edges. For a moment, it looked like she might turn and leave, but she stayed, her calm exterior a thin veil over the storm brewing inside. Margaret didn't budge. Her posture remained rigid, the bag of apples clutched tightly in her hands like a shield. The wide brim of her sun hat cast a faint shadow over her narrowed eyes, defiance etched deep into the lines of her face. With a huff, she adjusted her floral blouse, her chin lifting as if daring Danielle to respond. Her words still lingered in the air, sharp and unrepentant, thickening the space between them with a palpable unease. The Trader Joe's fell silent. The usual hum of casual chatter and cartwheels rolling over tile had disappeared, leaving only the weight of what had just been said. Near the avocados, Jake, a lanky teenage employee mid-sack, hesitated, his hands hovering over the produce. He swallowed hard, unsure whether to keep working or intervene. Behind the register, Lisa, her name tag slightly askew, peeked over the counter, her fingers frozen on the scanner. Shoppers halted mid-step. A young mom, Sarah, steered her child away toward the cereal aisle, though her eyes remained fixed on the confrontation. An older man by the potatoes gripped the edge of his cart, his gaze darting between the two women, waiting. Danielle's shock softened into something unreadable. She took a slow, measured breath, her fingers releasing their grip on her phone as she straightened slightly. The pause stretched, heavy and awkward, as Margaret stood firm, unapologetic. Around them the store held its breath, the tension pulsed, thick as molasses. A few shoppers exchanged nervous glances, shifting their weight uncomfortably, sensing the moment teetering on the edge. Jake cleared his throat but said nothing. Lisa craned her neck, eyes darting between Danielle and Margaret, her knuckles white on the counter's edge. The crowd, now fully invested, waited, silent, expectant, knowing whatever happened next would tip the scales entirely. Danielle set her basket down with a soft thud, the sound cutting through the stillness of the Trader Joe's. The quiet amplified it, making the moment feel heavier. She straightened, her green hoodie catching the overhead light, her presence growing in the hush that surrounded them, her gaze locked onto Margaret's. Not with anger, but with an unwavering steadiness that made the older woman shift slightly where she stood. "Ma'am," Danielle said, her voice deliberate and measured, slicing through the tension like a scalpel. "Do you even realize what you just said?" The question hung in the air, not sharp, not biting, but reflective. It was an offering, an invitation for Margaret to step back and consider the weight of her words, but the older woman wasn't swayed. "I said what I said," Margaret snapped, her voice rising, brittle with defiance. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." Her grip tightened around the bag of apples, her knuckles paling. The brim of her sun hat tilted slightly as she leaned forward, her posture rigid, unyielding. A gasp slipped from Sarah near the bread aisle. The crowd stirred. Jake, the teenage employee, stood frozen near the avocados, his hands motionless. Lisa, behind the register, craned her neck further, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. Tom, the older man by the potatoes, muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. A wave of uneasy whispers rippled through the store, low and murmured, the weight of what had been said settling over everyone present. Danielle didn't move, didn't flinch. She didn't shout, didn't close the space between them. Instead, she let the silence stretch, allowing Margaret's words to fully land, to fester in the air. And then, with a slow, thoughtful nod, she spoke again, her voice still calm, still firm. "All right," she said, her tone carrying more weight than volume. "Let's talk about that since you brought it up." The room held its breath, every pair of eyes locked on them, waiting for the storm brewing beneath Danielle's measured composure to break. Danielle shifted her stance, her sneakers steady against the Trader Joe's tile as she faced Margaret. She set her basket aside with deliberate care, her gaze unwavering, pulling the room's focus toward her. The air was thick with anticipation, every breath held in suspension. When she spoke, her voice was firm and deliberate, cutting through the hush like a blade. "You said I don't belong here," she began, letting the words settle, "but let me tell you something about where I come from." She paused, not for effect, but to allow the weight of the moment to expand, to give Margaret, and everyone watching, a chance to truly hear her. "My great-great-grandmother was born in Alabama," she said, her tone measured but resolute. "She worked fields she didn't own, her hands raw from labor, breaking her back so her children might have a chance. And her father? He was a slave, kidnapped, beaten, sold like property. And for what? To build the country you're standing in." Margaret's lips tightened, but she stayed silent. The crowd was transfixed. Tom lowered his phone. Ruth and Ed near the dairy section whispered to each other, their eyes fixed on Danielle, caught in the pull of her words. "My grandmother was a nurse in World War II," Danielle continued, her voice strengthening. "She risked her life overseas, tending to wounded soldiers, only to return home to a country that refused to let her sit at its lunch counters. But she stayed. You know why? Because she believed in its promise, even when it didn't believe in her." The room seemed to shrink around her, the weight of her story pressing down, the silence growing deeper. "My parents fought too, not with weapons, but with work. My mom is a librarian, teaching kids of all backgrounds, making sure they see themselves in the books they read. My dad's a truck driver, he'd pull over on a rainy highway to help a stranger, even someone like you. So, you're telling me I don't belong here, that I should go back to Africa?" She shook her head, her voice carrying something heavier than anger, something rooted in sorrow, in resilience. "Ma'am, I am as much a part of this country as you, maybe more, because my family paid for it in blood and sweat, in sacrifice. You'll never understand." Margaret's hands trembled around her bag of apples, the plastic crinkling under the pressure of her grip. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Danielle held steady, her presence unshaken, her words a mirror no one could look away from. The silence after Danielle's speech blanketed the Trader Joe's, heavy and unbroken. The weight of her words pressed into the air, leaving an echo that no one dared disturb. Margaret's face flickered with emotion. Anger, embarrassment, something else unspoken. Her hands trembled on her apples, her sun hat dipping slightly as she glanced around, searching for support. But there was none. Tom stepped forward first, his baseball cap in hand, his grip tightening around the brim. "She's right," he said, his voice breaking the quiet, firm but not unkind. "We've got to be better than this." His words cracked something open, a shift in the air. From near the dairy aisle, Ruth nodded, her voice soft but certain. "My husband fought in that war," she said, her wrinkled fingers gripping the handle of her cart. "He always told me the only color that mattered was the red on the flag." Lisa, behind the register, called out, her voice carrying through the store. "I've never seen anyone handle that so gracefully. Thank you." The murmurs grew. Sarah let out a soft breath, almost a gasp, her eyes still locked on Danielle. Jake, still standing frozen by the avocados, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Conversations began to stir, no longer hushed with tension, but shifting toward something else. Understanding, agreement, reckoning. Margaret gripped her cart tighter, her fingers pressing into the plastic handle, her shoulders drawn in. The fight in her faded, her defiance draining away as her gaze flickered downward. "I didn't mean," she started, her voice quieter now, the sharpness gone. But the words faltered before she could finish, slipping away unfinished. Choppers resumed their tasks, carts rolling, bags rustling, voices lifting once more, but the air had shifted. There was a weight to it, a subtle change, a reflection that hadn't been there before. Some faces looked inspired, others pensive, all touched in some way by what had transpired. Margaret was gone, the tension dissolved, yet Danielle's words held firm, their resonance stretching beyond the aisles, beyond the walls. The moment had passed, but its imprint remained, a quiet shift that no one could unfeel. The Trader Joe's settled back into its rhythm, but the atmosphere lingered, quieter, more thoughtful. The hum of conversation resumed, carts rolled once more, but something had shifted. Danielle moved through the aisles, her steps slower now, her mind replaying the moment. She reached for a few last items, lemons, a jar of marinara, her green hoodie still a steady presence amid the ebb and flow of the store. At checkout, Lisa scanned her items, her hands a little more careful, her smile tinged with something more than politeness. "What you said back there," she started, hesitating as she bagged the lemons. "It meant a lot. People don't always stand up like that, and definitely not with that much grace." Danielle met her gaze, offering a warm but tired smile. "Sometimes grace is the only way to break through," she said softly. "Anger just builds walls." Lisa nodded, sliding the receipt across the counter. "Thanks again," she murmured. Danielle took it with a small nod, then turned toward the exit, stepping back into the fading light of the evening. Outside, the California sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. As Danielle walked toward her car, her gaze landed on Margaret's hatchback, parked a few rows away. The older woman sat inside, gripping the steering wheel, unmoving. Her sun hat lay discarded on the passenger seat. Danielle hesitated. Should she approach? A flicker of possibility crossed her mind, but she let it pass. Some lessons needed space to take root. She slid into her car, turned the key, and drove off, dusk settling in as street lights flickered to life. That evening, Danielle sat at her mother's kitchen table, twirling spaghetti around her fork as she recounted the day. Grace, her graying curls pulled back, listened with quiet intensity before speaking. "You did right, honey," she said firmly. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone there. People like her might not change fast, but you planted a seed, and that's how it starts." Danielle nodded, her mother's words sinking deep, wrapping around the weight of the day. She wasn't sure if Margaret would ever change, but she knew the moment had mattered. Across town, Margaret sat alone at her own table, her dinner untouched, the ticking of the kitchen clock the only sound. Danielle's words echoed in the quiet, woven into this country, blood and sweat, chipping away at something she had held firm for so long. She thought of her grandchildren, their faces bright and unburdened, and felt doubt creep in. Sharp, unfamiliar, insistent. The story spread through the suburb, over morning coffee, in hushed conversations, in texts sent across town. A neighbor recounted it to a friend, someone posted about it online. People spoke of Danielle's poise, of the way she had stood her ground, and of how it had stirred something inside them. It became more than an incident. It became a lesson, a reminder of the power of words, of the weight of history, of the courage it took to confront ignorance with dignity. The moment had passed, but its ripples carried forward. Danielle finished her shopping, Margaret wrestled with her thoughts, and the town carried the echo onward, a quiet shift taking root in the spaces in between. Danielle didn't seek the attention that followed, but it found her. Strangers stopped her, their gratitude quiet but sincere. At the park, a mother shared a story of bias she had once faced. At the grocery store, a man nodded in silent appreciation. She accepted their thanks with a small smile, saying little, her green hoodie a quiet constant as her stand rippled outward. The suburb hummed with it, over coffee at the diner, in group texts, in hushed conversations, in social media posts that spread further than she realized. She handled it with such dignity, people said, recounting the way she had stood her ground without anger, without raising her voice. It became more than just a story. It became a lesson, a nudge toward confronting what many had dodged for too long. Danielle remained humble, but her words had struck a chord, lighting a spark in places she couldn't see. Margaret's change was slower, more uncertain. She avoided Trader Joe's for a while, unsettled by the memory of Danielle's voice, paid for it in blood, an echo she couldn't shake. She sat with her thoughts, with the image of Danielle standing firm, and for the first time she felt something shift inside her. Doubt gnawed at her, subtle but persistent, a crack in the certainty she had once held so tightly. She wondered if she ever saw Danielle again, if she would have the courage to apologize. She wasn't sure. But the fact that she wondered at all was something new. Danielle's moment in that store had shown the quiet power of kindness and truth over ignorance, not through force, but through conviction. Her words didn't just stay in the aisles of Trader Joe's. They traveled with Tom, who found the courage to speak up in a conversation he might have once let slide, with Lisa, who sought to understand rather than assume, with Sarah, who took a moment to teach her child about kindness in ways she hadn't thought to before. Danielle's quiet stand had reshaped the air around them, proving that strength doesn't always need to shout. To all who saw or heard, the message was clear. Your words matter. They can wound or heal. They can divide or unite. Danielle hadn't set out to be a hero, but in choosing to stand firm, she had woven hope into a town that had been silent for too long. If this moment stirred something in you, don't let it fade. Like, subscribe, share, spread courage and understanding, because change doesn't happen in silence. It happens when people choose to speak, to listen, and to build something better together.